Right on the back of the wild success of Doom 1 and 2, id Software made another game called Quake. This was like the Crysis 3 of the 90s because you could only run it well if you had what the equivalent of a gaming PC was back then. But it wasn't just a graphics showcase, this was a fun as hell first-person shooter with its rustic, moody environments and its kick-ass soundtrack by Trent Actual Reznor from Nine Inch Nails. Yeah, really. Not even to speak of its online multiplayer features long before every single video game in the world had that. It was kind of a big deal. This really was the Super Mario 64 of FPS games, you know, it was a proper 3D game with full range of motion. They both came out in 1996, and both of them are still ridiculously fun to play even 26 years later. Of course, the only problem was those damn system requirements. These were still the relatively early days of genuine PC gaming. Even though there were PC games beforehand, like Mega Man on DOS, this is when the standards for a PC were becoming high enough to allow actual good video games to run on it, but only if you were staying in front of it. They were literally publishing magazines back in the day to tell you how to build a PC that could run Quake because nobody knew how to do it back then. Even Doom was just barely squeezing by on most computers when it came out, and Quake was much more advanced, so you'd best pray to the computer gods to bless you with a Pentium processor, cause that 486 ain't gonna cut it anymore. Sighs Queen. It was also one of the first games to take advantage of 3D acceleration with the early 3D graphics cards, you know, if your dad was a millionaire. But much like Doom, they realized that designing things only for PC limited their audience to a relatively finite number of people that had an adequate machine. So much like they did for Doom, they started porting it to a bunch of other consoles, and by a bunch of other consoles, I mean two consoles, the N64 and the Sega Saturn. Why not PlayStation? I don't know. Both of these ports pale in comparison to the PC original, so to this day they're mostly just an interesting piece of history. Which brings us to the topic of the hour, Quake for the Game Boy Advance. Now I know what you're thinking, wait a minute Bino, they could barely put Doom on the GBA, why would they try to put Quake on it? Well, that's the thing, they didn't. This was the work of one Randy Linden, and if that name sounds familiar, he was the programmer for the Bleem emulator, which was an early PS1 emulator made in 1999, aka before emulation was cool. I guess you could say he's a bit of a legend, and yes, this prototype is very impressive to say the least. This was made in 2002 but was never finished or released in any official capacity, only being made available to the public by Randy himself a couple months ago after getting into contact with Forest of Illusion. So yeah, you could probably call this old news, but that's what I do best. Old news. And it's still Spook-Ass month, and Quake does have more than its share of horror elements, taking inspiration from Lovecraftian lore, so I figured, hey, why not? I mean, it is my channel, so really I don't gotta explain myself. The first thing you'll notice about this prototype is that it really is a 3D game. This isn't Doom, where it's converting 2D map data to 3D and verticality is an illusion. This really is an honest-to-God layers on top of layers 3D game. I'm talking polygons, boy. And it actually looks extremely authentic to the real Quake, with its rusty industrial environments, moody lighting, and dank underwater passages. Its decrepit, death-defying jungle gym level design. The graphical prowess of this prototype is on a level that I did not think the Game Boy Advance was capable of. Granted, it comes at a price. Resolution and frame rate. The super low resolution is to be expected for a GBA title, especially one with this much graphical complexity, and it's good enough that you can actually tell what you're looking at most of the time. Weapons and health pickups are largely legible to the human eye. Enemies, not quite as much. The frame rate, on the other hand, is super low. This is a very choppy game with very chunky pixelated resolution, and yet also very clearly Quake. It doesn't only look like it, but it feels like it too. It's fast and explosive, you got big boomy sound effects, there's platforming, which kinda works. And anyone who knows Quake will look at this and go, ah, yes, graphics. The gameplay is surprisingly fleshed out for something that would never become a full game, with pickups and underwater sections. There are even two types of weird, spidery enemies, one of which can shoot you and kill you in one hit from across the map because for some reason you start out with 10 health. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, I don't remember that from Quake. And you would be right. As I understand it, pretty much all of the assets in this game, despite having very clear and deliberate resemblance to what you might have seen in Quake, are all entirely original. Nothing was taken directly from the game, even though it was made to look that way. So when it comes to building things from the ground up, it doesn't get that much more ground up than this. Maybe ground beef? I don't know. Controls-wise, it's shockingly good, even with the frame rate. Running around and shooting and aiming all feels surprisingly natural and intuitive. You can even look up and down by holding the L and R buttons while pressing the D-pad without crazy texture warping issues, because this is a real 3D environment thanks to the blast processing on the GBA. A great feature this game has is aim assist, which is as welcome as it is completely unexpected. If you're looking at an enemy, the game will try to aim at the enemy so you don't have to be super precise, which is a godsend when the frame rate and resolution are as low as they are. I don't know how one would play otherwise. There are also 3 entire levels, not huge levels mind you, but I was expecting maybe 1 level, so this is fantastic. The attention to detail on the gameplay end with features like aim assist makes the prototype feel like it could have been a genuine, honest-to-God experience if it was ever turned into a full game. And considering this was way earlier in the console's lifespan than something like that Mario Kart demo was, it would have been even more impressive because it wouldn't have to compete with the DS or the Gay Station Portable. And that's the other thing. This had the potential to be Quake, one of the greatest FPS games of all time, on the go. Doom on the go was cool, but Quake? That would have been metal. Speaking of metal, there is unfortunately no 9 Inch Nails to be heard in this game, but the soundtrack is kinda fire anyway. One of the coolest things about this prototype is all the debug features. They're a little hard to navigate and I only understand maybe 40% of what they're supposed to be, but they have some really neat effects like turning off the textures and displaying vertexes. And what's really neat is that when you turn the textures off, the frame rate skyrockets into the stratosphere, allowing the game to be way faster and smoother. In a hilarious way, it's almost better to play this way because you can actually react in time and more reliably. And it's a great way of demonstrating what the GBA is capable of in theory with respect to this technology. We'll never see what this would have looked like as a full game, and honestly, it's entirely possible that if it got off the ground, the people who make the decisions would decide that the performance just wasn't good enough to carry an entire game. Today, if you want to play Quake on the go, they did bring it to Nintendo Switch, and there's also the Steam Deck, but 20 years ago, I feel like this could have been an acceptable option if it was ever brought to completion, but that's assuming that that would have even been possible to do in the end. Today, it remains a fascinating piece of history and a surprising demonstration of the capabilities of the Game Boy Advance. You can get this on the Forest of Illusion website if you're interested in playing it for yourself, but otherwise, you better get quaking.